Okay. Okay, it's 11:58. We'll start in about 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Okay, it's 11:59, so about a minute. Okay, I guess we'll get started. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me okay and that you can see the PowerPoint here. So just some verbal feedback just to make sure you can hear me okay.
I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. All right. Okay, I'd like to start by just letting everyone know that I extended the deadlines for the quizzes and the homeworks. So if you didn't get a chance to take a quiz or complete a homework for anything that's past due, I extended the deadlines to a week from today. So that's going to be Thursday, the 15th of October at 11:59 p.m. To give everyone a chance to make sure you get completely caught up. I can understand that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and a lot of us haven't done distance education before, and so a lot of the technology might be unfamiliar to some of you, getting used to using D2L. And so that was the motivation for extending those deadlines. So you want to make sure you get completely caught up by a week from today, 11:59 p.m. Thursday of next week. And I'm back with my bone t-shirt. Uh, so we're going to continue our journey of the skeleton. We explored the axial skeleton, and we're going to be wrapping that up today, looking at the skull. The skull is one of certainly the most complicated aspect of the skeleton. And so I have a physical model here, a nicely color-coded model that we can look at and study, and also the PowerPoint. So there's two PowerPoints. There's this PowerPoint that I have up now, which has more slides, so I can kind of give you better angles, better pictures. And then there's a summary PowerPoint that kind of distills uh, the slides into just a few. But the problem is that PowerPoint's too compressed, and so I put together this PowerPoint that has things a little bit more spaced out. Um, and so we're going to be using both of these in conjunction with today's lab. Okay, before we start, does anyone have any questions regarding the last lab when we were studying the vertebrae? The cervical, thoracic, lumbar vertebrae, the sacrum. Any questions on that earlier material? No questions? Okay, all right, we'll get started. Let me get my keyboard a little bit closer. All right. All right, so obviously we have a skull model here, and we're going to be looking first at the bones of the cranium. So the cranium houses the brain. So we have this protective covering for the brain. The brain is obviously an extremely delicate and vital organ, so it's well protected. And then we have the facial bones that make up the bones of the face. So we're going to be starting with the cranial bones first. All right, so as I mentioned, the cranium encloses the brain. And we're going to see there's different portions here at the base of the cranium, which are like little landing pads for the brain that kind of fit into these little spaces. So these are called fossa. So a fossa is a shallow depression. So the plural of that would be fossae. So we have an anterior cranial fossa. So it's going to be in the front, the anterior portion, a middle cranial fossa, and a posterior cranial fossa. So if we kind of look inside our skull, so I've removed one of the cranial bones so we can look inside. And we can see here, let me kind of find a good orientation here. Okay. So up here in front, the anterior portion, we have the anterior cranial fossa. So it's just the brain sits right there. A middle cranial fossa. Get kind of explore. It's a challenge getting the lighting just right in there because there are a lot of shadows. I should get like a little flashlight. But there you can see the posterior cranial fossa in blue, kind of like a little. Let's see if I can figure out the lighting here. So down in here, okay, posterior cranial fossa. So these fossae are for holding the skull. The brain sits on these fossae. Okay. I think this particular view on the PowerPoint slide is easier than dealing with the shadows inside the skull here. All right, so this bone here, this yellow bone, or the green bone here shown in the PowerPoint, is the frontal bone. Makes sense because it's frontally located, anteriorly located. And it actually, during early development, it actually starts as two bones that fuse together. So it's actually one bone as an adult. And then looking laterally, we have the parietal bone, and there's two of those. On this side, the parietal bone has been removed. So you can see here that they're symmetrically located, all right? Again, here in yellow, this is the frontal bone, anteriorly located. And just posterior to the frontal bone, located laterally, we have these two parietal bones. Again, this one has been removed so we can peer inside to the skull. All right, so here we're looking anteriorly on the PowerPoint. And again, you see the frontal bone here. Okay. And you can get a glimpse of the parietal bones a little bit. So if I turn it a little bit to the side, you get a little bit of glimpse here of the parietal bone. You can see that here in the PowerPoint, shown here in like a pink color. All right. Then the temporal bone is this structure here shown in brown. It's the temporal bone right in here. All of this is the temporal bone. And you can see it here laterally from the PowerPoint slide. Everything here shown in green is the temporal bone. You have two of them. So you have one on this side, and then you also have one on the left side as well, here, the temporal bone. Okay. Now these bones are appropriately named because the lobes of the brain that lie deep to them are named the same way. So deep to the frontal bone is going to be the frontal lobe of the brain. Deep to the parietal bone is going to be the parietal lobe of the brain. We're going to learn this. This is called the occipital bone, and so the occipital lobe is deep to that. So we'll be exploring these further. All right, now we can actually see these bones that we've just been talking about by looking inside the skull. Okay, so when the top part of the skull is called the calvaria, I think of that as like the skull cap, and you can remove it. You take a horizontal cut and take it off. And I haven't done that completely here. I just removed one parietal bone so we can look inside. But here in the PowerPoint, we're looking at what we would call a decalvarated skull because we have removed the calvarium. And so it allows us to peer inside, and we can see that the temporal bone that we just looked at exteriorly from a lateral position is also visible inside the skull. So let's take a look at that here on the model. So here, this brown bone here, so this is the temporal bone, okay? And when you look inside, you can see it, kind of turn it, you can see it here. Okay, so you can see it from a decalvarated view, and back here, you can see it here in brown. Kind of explore the angle to get the light. I guess it's impossible. I've been playing around with the light, and I'm going to have to set up a very special lighting system for future demonstrations. So you can see here the brown temporal bone. Everything here that's brown is the temporal bone. Okay, yeah. It's tricky because left is right and right is left using this. So I'll try to get right there. So everything there in brown is the temporal bone. Kind of zoom in. Yeah, I think that's the better way to do it. Okay. All right. And of course, there's two of them, symmetrically located left and right. All right, now we can take this temporal bone and we can disarticulate it from the rest of the skull. There are ways to basically break down these sutural ligaments that are holding these bones of the cranium together. And if you disarticulate it from the rest of the skull, this is how it looks on the PowerPoint. Okay. And so there's a part known as the petrous portion. Petrous means rocky outcropping. And so I'm going to kind of put my pointer on that. So it's like this little, it kind of looks like a little mountain here on the inside. That's the petrous portion. And we have the inner ear in here. So later in the semester, in Dr. White's lecture section, you'll learn about the apparatus of the inner ear. It allows you to hear and to maintain your body's equilibrium. And it's inside here. So it's called the petrous portion. Just think of like petrified wood, so rocky, it's made out of rock, right? Rocky outcropping is the transliteration of that word petrous. Now, there's also a squamous portion. Now, that word squamous should sound familiar. We learned when we were studying histology about the stratified squamous epithelial tissue, right? Simple squamous. So these were flat cells. And so this is the flat part, a very, very flat part of the skull right here. And so it's known as the squamous portion of the temporal bone, right here. Okay. All right, the squamous portion. And another important feature of the temporal bone is your ear hole, known as the external auditory meatus. So my probe is sticking right in there. The external auditory meatus, that's your ear hole. Okay. Right, if you stuck that in there, you would hit the diaphragm of the ear. So again, structure you'll be learning about later in the semester when you get to sensory organs. So external auditory meatus. Sometimes you hear the term external acoustic meatus. Means the same thing. All right. Another important landmark of the temporal bone is called the mastoid process. So a process is a structure that's proceeding from something. So this is like kind of proceeding in a direction away from the mass, the central mass of the temporal bone. So we call that a process. So that's the mastoid process. And there's muscles that originate here that you'll be learning about later. I won't go into those yet. Mastoid process. Okay. And so here you can see that on the PowerPoint. Now there's a little spiky object here. That's called the styloid process. That's this little spiky structure here. The brown paint has come off of it. That should be brown. Okay. And on real skulls, this is almost always broken off because it's very fragile. There's little muscles that originate from here that are involved in moving your tongue. You'll be learning about those later when we start muscle. Okay. Any questions so far about the bones we've talked about? Anybody? Okay. If you come up with anything, let me know. All right. And then the occipital bone. So here, that's this blue bone here, the occipital bone. So when you're looking at the skull, so this is obviously anterior view here, right? Okay, and then we can turn it around to posterior view. And you can see it makes up the posterior, but also the inferior portion of the skull. So here we're looking underneath the skull, the inferior view. Okay. All right, and again on the PowerPoint, you can see it here. So this is posterior, and then down here would be inferior, below the skull. Now you only have one of those, right? So to review, you have one frontal bone, you have two of these temporal bones here, and on the other side here, you have one occipital bone, and then these two parietal bones, the green one here, and then the one that's been removed. Those are the parietal bones. Okay. Okay, one very distinct feature of the occipital bone, so we're going to turn it inferiorly here, is this hole called the foramen magnum. So foramen means hole, and magnum means big. So it's a big hole, and as you might have guessed, your spinal cord comes up through there. Okay. All right, any questions? Okay. All right. So we're going to look a little bit more at the occipital bone. So we have here these are called occipital condyles. There's a video I'm going to show later. It'll illustrate these a little bit in a different way. So your skull, if you think of the skull, we talked about the atlas and the axis, the C1 and C2, the top two cervical vertebrae. And I mentioned how the atlas is so called because of the mythological character, the Atlas with the earth resting on his shoulders. So if you think of the skull as like the earth and it's sitting on the atlas, it sits right at these two little pads, the occipital condyles here and here. Okay, the occipital condyles. A condyle is like a convex rounded surface, and that forms your yes joint. So as it rocks, the skull rocks on C1 like this. See from above. So I'm turning it inferiorly so you can see where it articulates with C1 and enables you to like nod your head yes. Okay, all right. Okay, and now let's talk about the sutures. So these bones are held together by sutural ligaments. And these sutures have names, and I'm going to kind of review the names. So this suture here, so just going to get you oriented. So this is the anterior side of the skull, all right? So I'm going to turn it a little bit in the lateral direction, a little bit posterior, and you can see this line here that runs separating the frontal bone from the parietal bone right here. That's called the coronal suture, and it goes all the way across to the other side. Now remember, I've removed one of the parietal bones, so it's this that runs completely across like that. Okay, that's called the coronal suture. It kind of makes sense because remember when we learned about coronal sections, it's exactly where the coronal section would cut through, right? Okay. All right, remember coronal sections separate you into anterior and posterior portions. So this would be the anterior portion and then the posterior portion. And that suture separates anterior from behind it posterior. Okay. All right, we also have what's called the squamous suture. Now, we just talked about the squamous portion of the temporal bone, that flat scale-like. Squamous literally transliterates into scale-like portion of the temporal bone. And so this right here, this suture that separates the temporal bone from the parietal bone, that's called the squamous suture, the squamous suture. And so you can see that here in the PowerPoint, the squamous suture. Okay. All right. There's also a lambdoid suture, and that's, I think, nicely seen here on the skull. So again, anterior, posterior, and this suture right here separating the occipital bone from the two parietal bones. Okay, that right there, that's called the lambdoid suture. So named because it's shaped like the Greek delta, the Greek letter lambda, rather. Okay. All right, and so here we're just seeing that view in the PowerPoint that I just showed you on the physical specimen. You can see right here, this is the lambdoid suture, again, so named after the Greek letter lambda. Okay, and there's our occipital bone, our two parietal bones. Now, the suture separating the two parietal bones is called the sagittal suture, so named because of the sagittal cut. Remember, sagittal cuts separate left into right, left into right. And so this here is called the sagittal suture, again, separating the two parietal bones. And so you can see that here in the PowerPoint. You see part of it. Okay. All right. Any questions so far? Does anyone want to see a slide again? Anybody? Okay. All right. The sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone is one of the most interesting bones, perhaps the most complicated bone in the entire body. And so you can see it from a bunch of different positions here. So it's this red bone here, and it's one bone that goes completely through the skull to the other side here. From a decalvarated position, you can see it here. It's all the red in here is the sphenoid bone. So this red in here, kind of get the lighting here. This is the sphenoid bone here. See, it runs all the way across from one side of the skull to the opposite side. Okay. And so you can see those portions laterally here. Kind of get position better here. And then on the other side here, again in red. Okay. And inferiorly, you can see it as well down here. So down here, all of this here is the sphenoid bone. So we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail where we disarticulate it so we can see it a little bit better. Okay. So here again in the PowerPoint, we're looking at the lateral aspect of the sphenoid bone. This is a disarticulated sphenoid bone. In other words, we've dissolved those sutural ligaments that hold it together, the rest of the skull, so we can look at it separately. And it kind of looks like a butterfly, though the videos that I'm going to show you later say it looks more like a bat. It's a subtle difference there. And here in the little inset on the PowerPoint in pink here, you can see the sphenoid bone as it relates to the rest of the skull when it's articulated. Okay, so this would again be a decalvarated skull. We're looking from above down into the skull. Okay, so this is a drawing, and then this is an actual photograph of a sphenoid bone. Very complicated bone, very amazing bone. Now this forms during development. It's mind-boggling, and it kind of, if you're actually like holding a physical specimen in your hands, it kind of looks like a double-winged butterfly. So you have two wings here that are called the lesser wings. So the lesser wings are lesser. And then you got the two bigger wings called the greater wings. So the greater wings are the greater wings. So those are easy to memorize. And then in here, you have what's called the sella turcica. So that means Turkish saddle. And the pituitary gland sits in there. The pituitary gland we'll be learning about later when you get to the study of neuroscience. Okay, comes later. All right, so there you go. This little fossa, this little depression here is called the hypophyseal fossa. Fossa is a shallow depression. Okay. All right, so looking at the right lateral skull, so I'm going to turn, this is the right lateral skull. Okay, at least it's my right. And we can just kind of review the bones that we've been talking about. So I'll do that here. So we got the parietal bone, we have the temporal bone, and we have the frontal bone. Okay. And we're going to learn about another really neat bone here. It's called the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone. And then your upper jaw, that's the maxilla. The maxilla. We'll be looking at that soon when we get to the cranial bone, the facial bones, which are coming up. Okay. And then, of course, back here, we have the occipital bone. Okay. And then, of course, our favorite, the sphenoid bone here. Okay. Which remember goes all the way across to the other side, also shown here, and is visible on the inside as this all this red in there. Oh, there's a good view. Okay. That's our sphenoid bone. And you can see in here, if I can see how much dexterity I have. All right, so you can see the lesser wings here, and then so symmetrically on the other side. So there's one lesser wing, and then the greater wings are down here. It's trying to focus on my finger instead. So the greater wing and the lesser wing. Okay. There we go. All right. Okay, now the ethmoid bone, you have one of those. This is probably ties for first place as the most complicated bone, along with the sphenoid bone. It's a real specimen. If you're holding in your hands, actually, it feels like you're holding toilet paper, and it's very fragile. And so they're very often encased in plexiglass or plastic to protect it. So it's a very, very delicate bone, and sometimes in auto accidents, this bone can become damaged, and it's a very, very complex situation medically when that happens. And so the ethmoid bone is visible from a number of places. One place it's visible, kind of looking at the PowerPoint here, so this is a decalvarated skull. So right in here, this right in here, not the yellow, right? Remember, that's the frontal bone, but this right in here, that's the ethmoid bone, the ethmoid bone. And this is the ethmoid bone that's disarticulated from the rest of the skull. Okay. And so when we look inside our model here, I kind of put my pointer on it. Oh, right back there. All right in here, that's the ethmoid bone. Thinking of like installing some lights in here. Little battery operated lights. Okay. All right, now we can also view the ethmoid bone anteriorly, shown here. So these portions, these orange-like structures here, which we'll discuss, that's part of the ethmoid bone. And this medial, so if you look at the medial portion here of these three, the middle part, that's called the perpendicular plate. And then flanking it on both sides laterally, this is called the middle nasal concha. So these conchi is plural, we also have inferior. These are scroll-like structures that are covered with mucous membranes and help to cause turbulence in the air when you're breathing. So it causes the air to swirl, and that increases the amount of contact that the air has with these warm, moist mucous membranes, which allows for the air to be warmed and moistened before it gets to the lungs. So the lungs do not like cold, dry air. And so it helps to warm and moisten the air. And so these are scroll-like structures that cause the air to swirl, these conchi. Again, conchi is plural. So the two middle nasal conchi that are visible here from viewing the skull anteriorly are part of the ethmoid bone. Okay. All right, so again, ethmoid bone. All right. And here again, viewing from a decalvarated specimen. Now, there's a couple components to the ethmoid bone I want to describe as viewed superiorly, looking down into the skull. The cribriform plate and the crista galli. Crista galli literally means coxcomb. And it's a structure where it's kind of like a leathery bag that wraps around the brain. It's called the meninges, specifically the dura mater of the meninges. Dura means tough, like durable. Mater means mother, so it means tough mother. And the reason why they call it tough mother is because it's like leather. It's like really tough. Cutting through it, I mean, it's like tough. And so I'm going to try to see if I can get my pointer, my probe on that crista galli, a little bit challenged. But it's the structure that's sticking up back there. That's the crista galli. Looks just like a coxcomb. Okay. And then you see these little holes in here? That's called the cribriform plate. And you can see it, I think, also here nicely on the cartoon, on the PowerPoint. These little holes. So these little holes are called olfactory foramina. They're little nerves involved in olfaction. Olfaction is our sense of smell. You'll be learning about that a little bit later in this semester. All right. So again, the ethmoid bone here and the disarticulated ethmoid bone. Remember we saw the perpendicular plate when we were viewing the skull frontally? Kind of go back, show you. So that's this medial orange structure called the perpendicular plate. So, oops, how did that happen? Kind of go back here. That's what this is here. The structure is protruding down. That's the perpendicular plate. So you're looking at that. All right. Okay, and so there's a couple other structures of the ethmoid bone. We just looked at the perpendicular plate, but these two scroll-like structures flanking it are also part of the ethmoid bone. Okay, it's called the middle nasal concha. These little scroll-like structures that help to swirl the air around. All right, we're going to look briefly at a fetal skull. Let me close out my Malwarebytes, which is blocking my screen. Okay, all right. All right, so we have in the fetal skull portions that have not ossified yet. Those are the well-known soft spots of the fetal skull. So, if you visit a family and they have their infant there and they say don't touch those. Those are the soft spots. So these are portions that haven't ossified over. They're very rich in mesenchyme. So for this class, for this lab, we don't talk about mesenchyme, but I'm just throwing that in there because it was probably discussed in lecture. And so these are the fontanelles. So you have an anteriorly located one. So here we're looking superiorly down upon the fetal skull. So this is the anterior fontanelle and the posterior fontanelle. Sometimes they go by other names like occipital fontanelle because it's proximal to the occipital bone. So here we're looking at a lateral aspect of the fetal skull. And so there's that anterior fontanelle. So the anterior fontanelle is the one that we normally think of as the soft spot. And there's the posterior fontanelle. The mastoid fontanelle is of its proximity to the mastoid process of the temporal bone that we looked at a moment ago. And then the sphenoidal fontanelle makes sense because the sphenoid bone is right there. Right? So proximal to the sphenoid bone. Okay. All right, the maxilla. Okay, so we're going now to the facial bones. So we're moving from the cranial bones to the facial bones. So the maxilla, and I'm going to show you on Dimitri here. So the maxillae, all right, so there's two of them are here. This is your upper jawbone here, and also on the other side. Those are the maxilla, the upper jawbone. Okay. And of course, the lower jawbones here, right? That's the mandible and the maxilla here and here on the other side. Okay. Oh, and by the way, we got a great view of the ethmoid bone. When you look up, this is a really good skull model. So if you look way up in there, up inside the nasal cavity, up in there, you can see in yellow. Try to get a better view up there. You see that yellow up in there? That's the ethmoid bone up in there. Okay. That's the ethmoid bone. All right. All right, now the maxilla actually makes up the floor of the orbit. So you can see that on the model here. So again, this is the maxilla, and I'll try to turn it so you can see down in here. So we're going to try to peer into the orbit, try to find a good angle here. But you see this get over here, this system. All right, so that's a better angle. Okay, so that's the maxilla, and you see it comes up and it forms the floor of the orbit in here. Try to go in there. Okay, you see it's the same color. So it makes the floor of the orbit. Okay. Looking at the PowerPoint, here it's purple. So it's the maxilla shown here in purple, and it goes in and forms the floor of the orbit of the eye. Okay. Now, interestingly, you can also see the maxilla looking inferiorly. So again, shown here, it's kind of like a burgundy color, the maxilla, and then we go underneath inferiorly, and you can see it here. Kind of get the angle here, and then on the other side. These are the two maxillae. Okay. All right. Red here, that's another bone we're going to talk about in a second. And these are the two maxillary bones. Okay. So they make up the hard palate. So there's also a soft palate, which is a muscular arch. You'll learn about that if you take A&P2. All right. And here we have a real skull viewing inferiorly. And again, the hard palate, which are these two maxillary bones. Okay, any questions so far? I know it's a lot of material. The skull is the most challenging of all of the structures of the skeleton. It's definitely the most challenging. Any questions so far? Okay, all right. Again, this slide is showing that the maxilla makes up the floor of the orbit here. Okay. All right, then we have the palatine bones. So just think of the palate. All right, so remember here, these are the two maxillary bones. And then moving a little bit posterior, we have the two palatine bones. So I'm going to illustrate that here with Dimitri. So I'm going to put my pointer. This red bone right here, it's a palatine bone. And also on the other side, these are the two palatine bones. And these are the two maxilla. Okay. All right. And the palatine bones also rise up and form the walls of the nasal passages as well. All right. Next are the two zygomatic bones. So these are the yellow bones here. Use my finger, a little bit easier. It's a zygomatic bone. And go to the other side, and that's a zygomatic bone here in yellow. Okay. And you can see it's got all sorts of processes. Remember these processes that are kind of reaching out like arms, different parts of the skull, they call these processes. Okay. And you can see that the zygomatic bone here, when you look inside the skull, it forms the lateral walls of the orbit. So here, zygomatic bone, you see it's yellow, and if I follow it in, see it's yellow in there too. So it forms the lateral walls of the orbit, the zygomatic bone. Okay. The zygomatic bones are sometimes known colloquially as the cheekbones. So cheekbones. All right. All right, now there's a very famous structure known as the zygomatic arch. And so that's this here. So it's like a walkway that runs from the zygomatic bone to the temporal bone, right? The brown bone here is the temporal bone. So zygomatic arch. There's a muscle, it's your main chewing muscle called the masseter. That's your main muscle of mastication, of chewing, that elevates the jaw, the mandible, and it originates from there. And we'll be learning about that later when we study muscle, the zygomatic arch. Okay. All right, so again, viewing the skull laterally, just kind of review. So this is the zygomatic bone here. You got the temporal bone here. That's the squamous portion of the temporal bone. Remember, the suture is called the squamous suture. The external auditory meatus, your ear hole. The mastoid process, also part of the temporal bone. Okay. Viewing anteriorly, there's a very, very underappreciated bone. One of perhaps the most underappreciated bone of the human body. It's called the vomer bone. Just think of like vomer rhymes with Homer Simpson. That's this little blue bone in here. This vertical structure here is called the nasal septum, and we previously looked at the perpendicular plate. That's the superior portion of the nasal septum, part of the ethmoid bone. The inferior portion of the nasal septum is the vomer bone. Now, the vomer bone is also visible inferiorly. In fact, that's usually when we have face-to-face labs. That's usually where I put a sticker on it because it's a little easier to get a sticker there. So you see it here, that's the vomer bone. And on Dimitri, it's this medial structure. Can I get my pointer to stay on there? It's this medial structure here. That's the vomer bone. Vomer bone. It's one bone. Okay. All right. All right. Then there's a tiny little bone called the lacrimal bone. You have two of those. and I'm gonna kind of get my pointer in there. It's this orange bone in here. This little orange bone in here. That's called the lacrimal bone. Now you can always spot a real skull because real skulls rarely have that bone there because they usually get broken out. There's a little, it's called the lacrimal fossa. You can kind of see if I can get it here. See that little hole here? Okay, there's a duct called the lacrimal duct, and that's how your tears run. So if like you're crying, your tears run down through that duct into your nasal passages, and that's why you get a stuffy nose if you cry. What happens with real skulls is people stick like pencils and pens in here and then snap. It snaps out, and so it's missing from real skulls. And like 99% of them are missing the lacrimal bone. Okay. All right. Yeah, that's a good view of it there. And so in our cartoon on the PowerPoint, it's shown in green here, the lacrimal bone. And there's two of those. Then we have two nasal bones. They form the bridge of the nose. They're shown here in white, here and here. These are the two nasal bones. You might be wondering, well, where's the rest of the nose? Well, you have a lot of hyaline cartilage in here, and so that rots and decays. And so, unlike bone that sticks around for a while, thousands of years, the cartilage is going to deteriorate. So we got all we have left of it are the bridge of the nose, these two white nasal bones here. You can see them in the cartoon here shown in blue. All right, the mandible, recall, is the lower jaw. Okay, so, all right, and this should be, if you have a properly functional skull, it should be the only movable bone of the skull. If you have another bone of the skull that moves, then you need to get to the ER as quickly as possible. So that is called the mandible. And there's a few structures here I'd like to review. So this is called the mandibular condyle. So it's kind of like a knob-shaped structure, and it's part of the jaw joint. The jaw joint is called the TMJ, or the temporomandibular joint. It's actually a synovial joint, secretes synovial fluid, which is like a lubricant. And so that condyle, which is sometimes also called the condylar process, why? Because it's proceeding away from the mass. So you think of the mass of the mandible, and it's like a structure that's like proceeding in another direction. So that's what we mean by process. It's processing over somewhere else. And so it's also known as the mandibular condyle. So it forms part of that TMJ, the temporomandibular joint. Then looking at the anterior structure here, this is called the coronoid process. The coronoid process. Okay. And so that condyle, mandibular condyle, articulates or connects with the mandibular fossa. So the mandibular fossa is part of the temporal bone. And kind of looking at Dimitri here, I'll get a full view of it. So, try to orient properly. So here, that's that coronoid process we just talked about. That's the mandibular condyle here. And you see in the temporal bone, it kind of fits like in a little niche. Okay, it's the mandibular fossa. So this forms a joint. Okay, allows you to move your jaw, allows you to eat, talk. All right, so in the cartoon here, we're looking now at a decalvarated skull. We'll just kind of review the structures we've been talking about. So in brown here, this is the occipital bone. The yellow here, this is the frontal bone. And pink here, this is the sphenoid. We only have one of those. only one occipital bone, one frontal bone, right? And then we have these two temporal bones. Two temporal bones. And then we have the foramen magnum, that's that big opening through the occipital bone that allows the spinal cord to enter and enter the skull. And then the one ethmoid bone here. So we have a lot of these structures that are visible from a decalvarated skull looking superiorly down into it. And so here's a real skull showing those same structures in the foramen magnum, the little coxcomb, the crista galli. These are the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone and the greater wings of the sphenoid bone. It's like a double-winged butterfly. All right, so the bones of the orbit, we've kind of looked at those. Remember, the zygomatic bone forms the lateral walls of the orbit. The maxilla forms the floor of the orbit. The frontal bone forms the roof of the orbit. And we looked at that little lacrimal bone, right? And importantly, the sphenoid bone forms the posterior aspect of the orbit, shown here in pink. This hole here is called the optic canal. So this is where your optic nerve passes through. So that's the nerve that connects your eye to your brain. And it's a very important structure, of course, because we all depend so much on seeing. Let me see if I have on Dimitri here, I can illustrate. So I'm kind of sticking the pointer. Let's see if we can visualize this in there through the orbit. So right there, it's a little bit dark in there. I'm trying to adjust the lighting a little bit, but that's where the optic canal is, or the optic nerve passes through. I think we saw it a little bit better differently, right? Right there. I think you can see the pointer going through there. There you go. Okay. And if I stick the pointer through in the opposite direction, so you can see the optic canal passing through the sphenoid bone, it's like right here. See I'm wiggling the probe there. Okay. That's the optic canal. That's where the optic nerve passes through. Okay. All right. So here, this is the last slide, and you can see these bones that we've been learning. So again, this is a decalvarated skull. We're looking superiorly down into it. And you see here the blue frontal bone, the ethmoid bone here. And in yellow is the sphenoid bone. And here, where my pointer is, and here, these are the lesser wings. And these are the greater wings. So it's like a double-winged butterfly, kind of like a mutant butterfly with two sets of wings. The video I'm going to show you later says it looks more like a bat. So whatever you see in it is good with me. And then here we have the two temporal bones. Remember the petrous portion, the rocky outcropping. Just think of like petrified wood. And then here there's the occipital bone. And then these two in green, the two parietal bones. Okay, yeah, I love this drawing here. All right. Okay, any questions before we start playing some videos? And then I'm going to go over the homework. Any questions from anybody, even if it's a small question? Any questions for Dimitri here? Any questions at all? All right, let's hop into the video. So the video links are in the homework. So let me let me reshare appropriately. Let me get the homework up here. All right. Okay. All right. So can you all see the homework here where it says Lab 6? Can everyone see that? Okay, great. All right. Let me move this a little bit to the side. Okay, so what Dr. White and I did this time is we decided to just put all of the parts that are going to be in the homework that you're turning in at the very end in red, as opposed to having it mixed throughout. Just make it a little easier to follow. So these are the last 2 pages, and again, the homework, you just type your answer in, or you can put it on scratch paper and then take a photograph of it and then upload it. Either of those are fine. All right. So let me get back to the beginning here. All right. So basically, when you go through the homework here, you want to have your lab manual handy because all these page numbers refer to the lab manual. And you want to identify the structures, which we've already done. So we looked at the cranium, which protects the brain. So your brain case. We looked at the facial bones. Okay. And then from the lateral view, you want to make sure you can identify these bones. So you have the 2 temporal bones. You've got one here. You got the sphenoid bone here. Okay. And the ethmoid bone you have to view from the orbit. And again, I also showed you how you can view it in here as well, in yellow. You see it. Okay. And it's visible. It's just hard to get light on it. Actually, it's not too bad here. But you see in yellow, let me see if I can get my pointer on there. Okay. There, yellow in there, that's the ethmoid bone here. So remember, there's only one of those. And of course, you can see it from the other orbit too, the yellow that you see in there as well. Okay. A little hard to get right there. Okay. All right. So in your lab manual, they've got pictures too, and you just want to make sure you go like, oh, there it is. Oh, there it is. So you can see these things. All right. So it's time to watch a video. So let me fire that up. And I'm going to have to do a reshare. All right. Okay. If at any point when you're watching the video, if you don't hear any sound or you hear sound and it looks like there's no picture, let me know because it's going to be a sharing issue. All right, so I will play away.
Are you supposed to be able to hear something?
Oh, yes. Okay, yeah. All right, let me check because it's a sharing issue. Okay, that's it. Yeah, when you share a video with Zoom, there's 2 little check boxes that are kind of hidden at the bottom. It says share computer sounds, so, and optimize screen sharing for video clip. Thank you for letting me know. All right, so I'll start over. Okay, thanks.
The cranium is the part of the skull that encloses the brain. It's made up of the frontal bone, which ends at the coronal suture. Behind the frontal bone are the 2 parietal bones that meet right on midline at the sagittal suture. Right below the parietal bones on each side is a temporal bone. The temporal bone and the parietal bone meet at the squamous suture. Taking a look at the back of the skull, there is one bone that makes up the back of the skull called the occipital bone. And there's the lambdoid suture. Spanning the floor of the cranium is the sphenoid bone. It's kind of shaped like a bat. And spanning the distance between the two orbits is the ethmoid bone. You can see part of it here.
All right. Okay, I'll go back to the homework. Okay, all right. So again, you want to locate these bones. So we looked at the two little lacrimal bones, nasal bones. So kind of reviewing here, and then the inferior nasal conchae, looking in through the looking anteriorly through the nose. All right, and then we have another video. Make sure I'm sharing. Okay, and all right.
Overview of the facial bones. Let's begin our overview of the facial bones. There are 14 facial bones that make up the delicate features of the face. These are the nasal bones. They make up the bridge of the nose. The lacrimal bones are very small and hard to distinguish from the surrounding area. This is the left lacrimal bone in the medial wall of the orbit. The zygomatic bones are known as the cheekbones. The inferior nasal conchae are individual bones that can be seen projecting into the nasal cavity. The vomer also projects into the nasal cavity. The vomer is a single bone that forms the inferior portion of the nasal septum. The maxillary bones fuse together at the midline to form the upper jaw. The palatine bones are situated at the posterior border of the palatine processes of the maxillary bones and form the posterior region of the hard palate. The mandible is a separate bone that forms the lower jaw. Let's finish by reviewing the facial bones. Nasal bones. Lacrimal bone. Zygomatic bones. Inferior nasal conchae. Vomer. Maxillary bones. Palatine bones. Mandible.
All right. Any questions? Okay, let's go to the next video. Go back to the homework. All right. And so again, as you go through the homework, you just want to make sure you do these things. So you want to make sure that from the lateral view, you can see the sphenoid bone and the temporal bone. Okay, and then you get to another video, the temporal bone video. So we click on that. And then make sure I'm sharing. Okay. Is everyone hearing the audio okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Major landmarks of the temporal bone. Let's examine the major landmarks of the temporal bone. This is the temporal bone. It's found on both the right and left sides of the skull. The opening for the ear is the external acoustic meatus. The external acoustic meatus serves as a handy landmark for dividing the bone into 4 regions. The region surrounding the external acoustic meatus is called the tympanic region for its relationship to the ear. The flat region superior to the external acoustic meatus is the squamous region.
By the way, on
The
that,
region
they're
posterior
highlighting more
and
than the
inferior
squamous
to the
region. Let me
external
just kind of, because it's a little bit misleading in the video here. So you'd think that everything shown here in white is the squamous. It's this flat scale-like part here. Okay, that's the zygomatic arch there. Okay.
region. The region posterior and inferior to the external acoustic meatus is the mastoid region. The internal surface of the temporal bone forms a mountainous ridge containing the inner ear that is called the petrous region. Now let's take a look at some major landmarks surrounding the external acoustic meatus. 2 projections are found inferior to it. The more blunt projection is the mastoid process. The other projection is the styloid process, which resembles a stylus, slender and pointed, so it tends to partially break off of real human skulls, as seen here. Both the mastoid process and the styloid process are sites of muscle attachment. Directly anterior to the external acoustic meatus is a depression called the mandibular fossa. This is the socket where the mandible, or lower jaw, articulates with the skull, forming the temporomandibular joint. Immediately anterior to the mandibular fossa is a projection called the zygomatic process. The zygomatic process helps form the zygomatic arch, a bony bridge connecting the temporal bone to the zygomatic bone, or cheekbone. Let's finish by reviewing the major landmarks of the temporal bone. Temporal bone. External acoustic meatus. Tympanic region. Squamous region. Mastoid region. Petrous region. Mastoid process. Styloid process. Mandibular fossa. Zygomatic process.
All right. I want to clarify one thing from that video. So let me go back to my my skull here. Okay, so this shown here in yellow, this is the zygomatic bone. Okay, and then here in brown, this is the temporal bone. Now notice the temporal bone has this process. This is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. It's part of the temporal bone, that's why I say of the temporal bone, but it's proceeding over to the zygomatic bone. So that's why we call it the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, because it's the part of the temporal bone that's proceeding over to the zygomatic bone. Now, this process here of the zygomatic bone is called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, because it's proceeding over to the temporal bone. So I say of the zygomatic bone, right? It's the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Together, they form the zygomatic arch, which is an origination point for your main muscle of chewing, mastication. The main muscle of mastication is a powerful chewing muscle. All right, let me go back to, I'm going to try to reshare here. Go back to the homework. All right, next we have the mandible video. And so this gives the structures that you need to know. And I'll get that playing here. My keyboard fell asleep. There we go. And let me reshare. Okay. All right.
Major landmarks of the mandible. Let's examine the mandible. The mandible is a single bone that forms the lower jaw. It articulates with the rest of the skull at the temporal bone. The mandibular body runs in a horizontal plane. The posterior regions that run in vertical planes are the mandibular rami. This is the left mandibular ramus.
Now, ramus means bar-like, so it's like a bar-like structure.
The mandibular body and ramus meet at the mandibular angle. The mandibular foramina are located on the medial surfaces of the mandibular rami. These openings permit the passage of nerves carrying sensation from the lower teeth. The superior posterior border of the mandible has a bony knob that articulates with the skull. This projection is the mandibular condyle. Anterior to the mandibular condyle is a U-shaped notch called the mandibular notch. And anterior to the mandibular notch is the coronoid process. Looking on the anterior surface of the mandible, we can see two openings called the mental foramina. These openings serve as passageways for blood vessels and nerves.
Now remember, mental means chin. It's kind of an unusual Latin derivation. You think mental means brain, so you think that would be not where you would have the mental foramina, but remember, mental means chin. Okay.
Traveling to the chin. The mandibular body has alveolar processes, which are bony elevations that surround the sockets containing the teeth. Here you can see an alveolar process around one tooth. Let's finish by reviewing the major landmarks of the mandible. Mandibular body. Mandibular ramus. Mandibular angle. Mandibular foramina. Mandibular condyle. Mandibular notch. Coronoid process. Mental foramina. Alveolar process.
All right. Let me go back to the homework. Okay, all right. All right, next we have a video featuring the occipital bone. Okay, let me reshare. Okay, here we go.
Major landmarks of the occipital bone. Let's examine the major landmarks of the occipital bone. The occipital bone is a single bone that forms the back of the cranium. This is the lambdoid suture, named after the Greek letter lambda. The lambdoid suture is where the occipital bone fuses with the parietal bones. The occipital bone curves around and forms this inferior area of the skull too. It contains the foramen magnum, which is where the spinal cord exits. On either side of the foramen magnum are projections called the occipital condyles, where the skull articulates with the vertebral column. Let's finish by reviewing the major landmarks of the occipital bone. Occipital bone, lambdoid suture, foramen magnum, occipital condyles.
All right. Go back to the homework. Okay. All right, and then we get to the part of the homework identifying bones of the skull viewed anteriorly. Okay, so we went over all of those. And then the bones of the orbit. And kind of working through here, we got a couple more videos. Okay.
Major landmarks of the temporal bone. Let's examine the major landmarks of the temporal bone. This is the temporal bone. It's found on both the right and left sides of the skull. The opening for the ear is the external acoustic meatus. The external acoustic meatus serves as a handy landmark for dividing the bone into 4 regions. The region surrounding the external acoustic meatus is called the tympanic region for its relationship to the ear. The flat region superior to the external acoustic meatus is the squamous region. The region posterior and inferior to the external acoustic meatus is the mastoid region. The internal surface of the temporal bone forms a mountainous ridge containing the inner ear that is called the petrous region. Now let's take a look at some major landmarks surrounding the external acoustic meatus. 2 projections are found inferior to.
So this video repeats twice in the homework, so we're watching this again, but I think it's good to watch it again. So there's only 1 minute left.
To it. The more blunt projection is the mastoid process. The other projection is the styloid process, which resembles a stylus, slender and pointed, so it tends to partially break off of real human skulls, as seen here. Both the mastoid process and the styloid process are sites of muscle attachment. Directly anterior to the external acoustic meatus is a depression called the mandibular fossa. This is the socket where the mandible, or lower jaw, articulates with the skull, forming the temporomandibular joint. Immediately anterior to the mandibular fossa is a projection called the zygomatic process. The zygomatic process helps form the zygomatic arch, a bony bridge connecting the temporal bone to the zygomatic bone, or cheekbone. Let's finish by reviewing the major landmarks of the temporal bone. Temporal bone. External acoustic meatus. Tympanic region. Squamous region. mastoid region, petrous region, mastoid process, styloid process, mandibular fossa, zygomatic process.
All right. Does anyone have any questions? Always feel free to ask questions. So I'm here to help out. Okay, and now we're going to examine the sphenoid bone. So this is the most complicated bone, I think, in the entire skeleton. All right. Trying to get the video to come up. Try again. There we go. And we reshare. All right.
Major landmarks of the sphenoid bone. Let's examine the major landmarks of the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone forms part of the floor of the skull and is best observed by removing the top of the skull. The sphenoid bone spans the central floor of the skull and is shaped like a bat. Here is the body of the bat, and here are the bat's wings. This central region is called the sella turcica. The depression where the pituitary gland sits is called the hypophyseal fossa. These little triangular regions, which form an overhang, are called the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. The wings of the bat are the greater wings of the sphenoid bone. These two openings in the lesser wings are the optic canals. The optic nerves pass through the optic canals, carrying sensory information to the brain from the eyes. On the greater wings of the sphenoid are the foramina rotundum and the foramina ovale, which are passageways for nerves. Let's finish by reviewing the major landmarks of the sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone. Sella turcica. Hypophyseal fossa. Lesser wings. Greater wings. Optic canals. Foramina rotundum. Foramina ovale.
All right. We go back to the homework. Were there any questions from that video? All right, and then now we're going to explore the temporomandibular joint. Okay, here we go. It's a short one.
The temporomandibular joint is where the lower jaw articulates with the skull. The lower jaw is called the mandible. The part of the mandible that articulates with the skull is this bony knob called the mandibular condyle. It fits right into a depression in the temporal bone called the mandibular fossa.
Okay. All right. And then review the hyoid bones. So again, these parts you're just simply reviewing, but the parts that you actually have to do are in red here at the end as far as the homework that you're turning in. Now, there's a Kahoot little practice quiz here, these fun little Kahoots. And then there's a fabulous free app. I recommend that you get it. It's called Essential Skeleton 4. And it enables you to rotate these structures in 3D and kind of see them from different angles. You can touch on structures and it'll give you the names of them. And there's one free app that's one of my favorites. If you happen to have an iPad or a tablet, it's called the BoneBox Skull Viewer, and it's free. And it gives you, I think, the most impressive 3D view of the skull. It's really an amazing app. And again, it's free if you have a tablet, if you have an iPad or tablet. So definitely check out the Essential Skeleton 4. All right, so let me go back to the video here. Okay. All right, does anyone have any questions about any of the structures? Because we do have a little bit of time left here, and I can use a little bit of that extra time to review. Did anyone have any specific questions? Okay, let me try. Okay, again, all right, so got our skull model here. So viewing frontally, we'll review the structures. So we have the frontal bone. Okay, and remember the frontal bone also makes up the roof of the orbits. You can see in here. Also on the other side, the roof of the orbits, the frontal bone. And there's only one frontal bone. And then we have the maxillary bones. This is the upper jaw. Then we have these two nasal bones here shown in white, the two nasal bones. These make up the bridge of the nose. And then we have the zygomatic bones here shown in yellow, the zygomatic bone, the zygomatic bone. Okay. And then we have the lower jaw, the mandible. This is mandible here. The mandible is one bone. And then the alveolar processes. These are the little, they proceed from the maxillary bone, and they're these little processes that wrap around the teeth. And also in the mandible, you have it as well. These little processes that wrap around the teeth, help to hold the teeth in. Okay. Now, if we look inferiorly up through the nasal passages here, we can see the ethmoid bone. I have only one ethmoid bone in there. Okay. And then we have the lacrimal bone. That little orange bone in here, the lacrimal bone. There. And you can see in the orbit, you can see the ethmoid bone here. And notice that the maxilla also forms the floor of the orbit as well. You can see it's the same bone. Get my pointer a little bit better. Okay. And then also looking in the orbit in red here in the back, posteriorly, we have the sphenoid bone. There's only one sphenoid bone, but it runs all the way across from left to right. So that's the sphenoid bone, again, forming the posterior aspect of the orbit. All right, and then we have the vomer bone. Right there, that little doohickey. And then viewing laterally, okay, laterally, we have the sphenoid bone here. We have the temporal bone. We have the zygomatic bone. And of course, the frontal bone again. And green here is the parietal bone. And in blue here is the occipital bone. And then now kind of looking closer at the temporal bone, this ground bone here, we have the external acoustic meatus, also known as the external auditory meatus. And the spiky structure here is that styloid process. It kind of looks like the stylus of a pen. And this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Okay, as it's proceeding over to the zygomatic bone. Remember, this is called the zygomatic arch. And here again is the sphenoid bone. Back here you can see the blue occipital bone. And the mandible, remember this was called the ramus of the mandible. Ramus means bar-like. And then the mandibular angle here. And we have the mandibular condyle, the coronoid process. Remember that mandibular angle forms this joint here called the temporomandibular joint. So this little fossa here in the temporal bone is called the mandibular fossa. It's like a little concave depression that receives the mandibular condyle, this knob-like structure. And you can see the mental foramen. Okay, little nerves and blood vessels go through there, and there's of course one symmetrically located on the other side. This, by the way, is called the infraorbital foramen. Infra, below, right? Inferior. Orbital, so below the orbit, and it's a foramen. So these names are pretty nice. Help us to memorize them. Okay, all right, now if we view the skull posteriorly, right, we can see the occipital bone, and it goes all the way inferiorly. And this, of course, is the foramen magnum. And these two knobs here, these are the occipital condyles that sit on top of the atlas, which is C1, the superiormost cervical vertebra. And then if we look then inferiorly, okay, all right, so in red here, this is the sphenoid bone. Remember, there's one, it runs all the way across. And remember Homer Simpson, the vomer bone rhymes with Homer, the vomer bone. That's this medially located bone here. And then we have the two palatine bones here, here and here, the two palatine bones. And then the maxilla, which remember forms the upper jaw, right, here and here. Right, they're visible underneath here as well. You can see it's the same color here. And so these form the anterior portion of the hard palate here and here. And these are the two palatine bones. The palatine bones. Okay. All right, and then now if we, I forgot to mention the mastoid process here. That's the mastoid process. Okay. All right, and this was, of course, the mandibular angle. Kind of looks like an angle, kind of like an obtuse angle. So that's a way to remember it. And then this horseshoe-shaped structure, it's the body of the mandible. Okay. And then now viewing now, looking down superiorly into this partially decalvarated skull, we can see a bunch of structures in here. So This kind of looks like the comb of a male chicken, cock's comb. That's the Crista galli. And that's like a little attachment point there for that leathery bag that surrounds the brain, the dura mater, which remember means tough mother. And all this yellow in here, that's the frontal bone. And then the cribriform plate is also part of the ethmoid bone. Remember the Crista galli, cribriform plate, all this shown here in yellow is part of the ethmoid bone. And those little holes there are the olfactory foramina. Got little nerves there that enable you to produce your sense of smell, of olfaction. And then in red here, going across, this is that bat or double-winged butterfly structure called the sphenoid bone. Very complicated structure. And you can see the optic canal there. The optic nerve passes through there. And then the sella turcica, right? Let me kind of get my pointer better. Sella turcica, and that's the hypophyseal fossa where the pituitary gland sits. So it's got a little seat in there. Remember, sella turcica means Turkish saddle. And in brown here, kind of shown here, this is the temporal bone, and this is the petrous portion. Petrous means rocky outcropping. So it's like a mountain here, and you have the apparatus of the inner ear in here. And that hole there, that's the internal auditory meatus. Kind of see it there. Okay. There's a nerve that goes through there. You'll learn about this when you get to the neuroscience. A nerve that enables you to send information, allows you to hear and judge your sense of balance. And in blue back here, that is the occipital bone. And of course, the big hole there is the foramen magnum. Okay, lots of bones here. Okay. And remember the posterior cranial fossa? It's like a little, kind of so you can get an angle in there. There you go. These little pads, the posterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and then the anterior cranial fossa. Okay, so these fossa means shallow depressions. So these are like little pads for, or regions where the brain sits. Okay, any questions? Any questions at all? I'm happy to review the skull. Remember the little vomer bone here? All right, and remember the vomer bone is also visible inferiorly. It's this median region here. All right, that's the vomer bone. Of course, the sphenoid bone, the two palatine bones. Okay. And the temporal bone. So this is the squamous portion, this flat. You can see how, maybe we can get a view, you can see how flat it is. So it's like really flat here. It's the squamous portion, means scale-like. Oh, and let's review the sutures. So this is going to be called the squamous suture here. And this means scale-like. Of course, that's the parietal bone, temporal bone, sphenoid bone, frontal bone, and the zygomatic bone. This little spiky structure here is the styloid process. Just think of the stylus of a pen. And this is the external auditory meatus, your ear hole. And this is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. It's an origination. There's an insertion, a muscle that inserts here. You'll learn about later. And this is called the zygomatic arch. Okay, there's a muscle that originates here that inserts on the mandible. That's your main chewing muscle. Okay. And this was the mandibular condyle, and that's the mandibular fossa. So a concave depression in the temporal bone, and it forms the TMJ, known as the temporomandibular joint. Temporo for temporal bone, mandibular for mandible, and it's a joint. Okay. And this is the coronoid process here. Coronoid process. And the mental foramen, you have two of those, of course, so symmetrical. And then in here again, the little lacrimal bone, the little lacrimal fossa. So there's, okay, and that's how these bones get snapped out. And look at the rest of the sutures. So we talked about the squamous suture here. And this was the coronal suture here. So that articulates the frontal bone with the two parietal bones, parietal bone, frontal bone, coronal suture. Then we have the lambdoid suture, which we view posteriorly here. Lambdoid suture. Looking inferiorly, so this was the foramen magnum, and these are called the occipital condyles. So C1, that's your superiormost cervical vertebra, known as the atlas, and these condyles sit on top of the atlas like the earth sits on Atlas's shoulders. So you can think of the skull as like the earth. The skull is roughly spherical, very roughly spherical, okay? The occipital condyles. All right, and of course, this is the mandible. And this bar-like structure is the ramus of the mandible. And this angle here is called the mandibular angle. It's an obtuse angle, larger than 90 degrees. And this is the body of the mandible. It kind of looks like a horseshoe, kind of like viewed from here. Kind of looks like a horseshoe, the body of the mandible. Okay, and then we have the two nasal bones. Okay. And when you look through the orbit, you can see the sphenoid, the back of the orbit here in red. That's the sphenoid bone. Now remember, the frontal bone also forms the roof of the orbit in here. It's the same color. And the zygomatic bone, you can see, forms also the lateral walls of the orbit. And the maxillary bone helps to form the floor of the orbit. So kind of turn in there, you can see it's the same color, it's the same bone. Okay, running through here, it's the same color. Okay, that's our little lacrimal bone in there. Okay, and the yellow here, that's the ethmoid bone. There's one ethmoid bone. And of course, the sphenoid bone is the red in the back here. Okay. Kind of get a little bit better angle there. And you can see, although it's kind of shady back there, you can see the optic canal. See if we can get the angle just right. A little hard to see. Yeah, a little hard to see that from this angle. It's better on the cartoons. You can kind of see it now. Let's see if I can navigate back there. Kind of right there. Optic canal. All right. And that optic canal is also visible looking inside the skull. That's where the optic canal is. You see there's symmetrically one on the other side as well. Okay. And again, the coxcomb, the crista galli, the cribriform plate. Those are part of the ethmoid bone. All right, and get nice view here of the petrous portion of the temporal bone, as is the apparatus of the inner ear. This is just part of the piece of plastic that helps hold the skull together, so just ignore that. Same thing, obviously, with these. Okay, just ignore those. All right. So are there any questions at all? Covered a lot of stuff here. Any questions? Any questions at all? Okay, so remember I extended the deadlines for the quizzes and the homework. So go and if you haven't finished something, make sure by a week from today you get those done. So remember there's 2 quizzes in there. You want to make sure you get those completed and the homework. And with that said, are there any questions? Even a little tiny question. All right. Well, thank you all for joining in, and I will see you next week. And of course, if you have any questions, you want to attend any of my open office hours, I'm free. I have office hours immediately following lab today. And then, of course, so you can shoot me an email or a text, and I'm happy to help you out if you're having any trouble with the homework or anything like that. Okay. So Dimitri's going to say goodbye. Goodbye. And I'll see you guys next week. All right. Thank you again for joining. Take care. Bye-bye now.